The poster said the Indians were coming, not as soldiers, but as something worse, a myth in uniform, a threat designed to make civilians surrender before the fighting reached their streets. Some believed it, because after years of occupation, fear is easier to accept than hope. But when Indigenous Canadians stepped out of the smoke and into those liberated towns, what arrived was not the monster from the propaganda. It was a man sharing his rations, a medic kneeling beside a stranger, a soldier so tired his hand shook as he lit a cigarette. And still, he offered the last one to someone who had nothing. And here is the part most Canadians were never taught. For many of those Indigenous veterans, the war was not the hardest battle. Coming home was. They fought for a country that needed them overseas and then asked them to prove they deserved the very rights their uniform was supposed to represent. This is the story of Indigenous veterans in Canada, before the war, in the war, and in the uneasy years after. It is a story of courage under fire and of promises that did not always survive the return voyage. In Canada, the years before the Second World War were full of speeches about duty and unity, the kind of words that sound strong when you say them into a microphone, the kind you can print on posters and paint on walls. But unity has a way of sounding different depending on where you stand. For many Indigenous people, Canada was not only a flag, it was a system, a set of policies, officials, and social structures that could shape a life long before a person ever touched a rifle. Indigenous communities across the country were not one story. They were many stories, spread across vast distances, different nations, different languages, different histories. Their relationships with Canada were complex, layered, and often painful. But there was a shared reality many recognized. Decisions about Indigenous life were often made far away by people who treated communities as administrative problems rather than human worlds. And then the world began to tilt in 1939 when war erupted in Europe again. Canadians were pulled into something larger than anything most had ever known. The radio turned battlefields into living rooms. Newspapers turned distant cities into names you could pronounce. The country shifted into wartime rhythm. What is striking is that many Indigenous men volunteered, not because the state compelled them, not because the situation at home was comfortable, not because their relationship with Canada was uncomplicated. War has its own gravity. It pulls at pride. It pulls at duty. It pulls at the desire to prove something to the world, and sometimes to your own country. Why did they enlist? Some did it for steady pay and meals during hard years because the Depression had not spared Indigenous communities. Some did it because brothers or friends were going and loyalty can outweigh politics. Some did it because they believed their service might change the way Canada looked at them. And some did it because in their own cultural traditions, protecting others was not a slogan. It was a responsibility. Simple explanations are what propaganda loves. Reality is messier and more human. When you enlist, you are entering a bargain. You are saying, I will risk my life for this country. And in return, you expect the country to treat your life as valuable. For many Canadians, that bargain felt solid. For many Indigenous Canadians, it came with an unspoken question. Will this finally make us equal? Training made the war real. It is the first place war enters your body even before it enters the battlefield. Early mornings, shouted orders, a rifle that becomes an extension of your hands, boots that blister your feet and teach you to endure without complaint. long days of repetition that turn fear into routine. It is also where strangers become a unit. And for some indigenous recruits, something unexpected happened. For the first time in their lives, they could be judged by what they could do, not by what people assumed they were. That does not mean prejudice vanished. It did not. Training camps were made of men, and men carried the society they came from. There were slurs. There were moments of exclusion. There were officers who treated indigenous recruits differently, and recruits who felt they had to work twice as hard to be treated half as fairly. But the military had its own brutal logic. Competence mattered. In a world moving toward combat, the men who could march, shoot, repair, drive, communicate, and keep calm under pressure mattered. And sometimes that reality pushed back against old assumptions, not because the institution was enlightened, but because survival is persuasive. That created a new kind of hope, a dangerous kind of hope, because hope does not only make you dream, it makes you trust, and trust makes betrayal hurt. As training turned into deployment, the war stopped being something on the radio. It became a ship. It became an ocean. It became the heave of the Atlantic under your boots, and the sense that behind you was everything you had ever known, and ahead was a continent on fire. Europe was not a stage. It was a ruin. Entire cities broken open, rail lines twisted, bridges destroyed, fields cratered, streets lined with brick dust and smoke, and everywhere civilians, people trying to keep living while history ran over them. Indigenous soldiers were part of that same Canadian force. They marched in the same columns, ate the same rations, slept in the same wet cold. They served in the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. They were drivers, medics, infantrymen, technicians, gunners, clerks, and sailors. They were not a separate war. They were the war. War is often less heroic than people want it to be. Heroism exists. Bravery exists. But the daily substance of war is exhaustion, monotony, fear, and waiting. It is the long silence before the sudden chaos. It is the way your body learns to live with cold and hunger. It is the way you stop noticing the smell of damp wool and oil and smoke because your brain has other priorities. Picture a night watch, not a dramatic one. The kind where your eyes burn and your mind plays tricks, where the wind makes a sound and you do not know if it is a branch or a boot, where you think about home and then you force yourself not to, because thinking about home can soften you, and softness can kill you. In those moments of compressed danger, identity changes in a specific way. A soldier becomes a soldier. And sometimes in that narrowing, a strange form of equality appears. Not equality of rights, not equality of dignity and policy, but equality of danger. The man beside you does not care where you are from if you cover him when he moves. He cares if you hold steady. He cares if you do what you said you would do. That can build trust faster than any speech. It can build brotherhood, the kind that lives in shared terror and shared duty. But while soldiers formed bonds in the mud, another force was shaping the war far beyond the battlefield. Propaganda is not simply lying. It is engineering. It is designed to reshape what people believe is possible so that resistance feels pointless and surrender feels sensible. In occupied Europe, propaganda did not just spread fear. It organized it. It took stereotypes already present in the cultural bloodstream and sharpened them into threats. Indigenous soldiers were vulnerable to that kind of demonization because Europe had already consumed decades of colonial myth-making through popular culture, the savage, The primitive, these were not truths. They were fantasies constructed over generations. And fantasies can be turned into fear with a single poster. So in some places, civilians heard warnings that did not just say, "The Canadians are coming." They said the Indians were coming. Occupation does something specific to the human mind. It starves hope. It trains civilians to believe the worst will always happen because believing that can feel safer than being disappointed again. So yes, some believed it. They hid. They imagined monsters. And then liberation arrived, not as myth, but as men. Tired men. Dirty men. Men with hollow cheeks and eyes that had seen too much. Men who were not there to perform a stereotype, but to move forward, to push the enemy back, to survive. In that collision between propaganda and reality, something happened. The monster dissolved. Because the first real contact between a civilian and an Indigenous Canadian soldier was often a simple human moment. A ration shared. A child handed chocolate. A medic offering help. A tired soldier offering his last cigarette to someone who had been living without anything. Those moments do not erase the brutality of war, but they do expose propaganda for what it is, a desperate attempt to rewrite human beings into something less than human. To give this story a face, we need a name, not because history needs a hero to be real, but because people do. A name gives the story weight. It gives the account someone to follow through the fog of statistics and policy. In Canada, when people discuss Indigenous military service, one name surfaces again and again, not as a myth, but as a documented life that refuses to fit inside a simple narrative. Tommy Prince. If you have never heard that name before, understand this. His story is not powerful because it is tidy. It is powerful because it carries the central contradiction of this entire account: respect earned under fire and dignity questioned at home. Prince was Anishinaabe from Manitoba. He joined the military and during the Second World War served in elite high-risk operations. The kind of war that happens quietly, without fanfare, where the details are measured in discipline, patience, and nerve. In that world, you do not survive by being loud. You survive by being precise. War has its own language, and in that language, the only currency that truly matters is capability. You cannot fake it. You cannot talk your way into survival. Under pressure, the battlefield rejects everything except what works. Prince became known for what worked. There are accounts about him that sound almost implausible until you remember what war does to reality, how it forces ordinary people into moments that should be impossible. One of the most telling episodes is not dramatic in the cinematic sense. It is dramatic in the real sense, simple, terrifying, and brutally practical. When communication lines were cut under fire, each repair drew enemy attention. Every movement was a risk. And if you kept sending men into the same exposed position, you started calculating how many you would lose before you ran out. So Prince did what war demands. He improvised. He repaired lines under fire and then concealed the evidence, covering fresh earth with grass and mud, blending it back into the landscape so the enemy would see nothing had changed. That detail tells you everything about the mind of a soldier who has learned to think the way the battlefield thinks. Not bravery as a feeling, but bravery as a decision, repeated while your heart is pounding and your hands are moving anyway. This is why soldiers remembered him, not because he was a symbol, because he was effective, because he did the kind of work that kept other people alive. And in the military, that kind of reputation spreads through trust, not through speeches, but through knowing who stays steady when everything collapses. But it would be wrong to let Tommy Prince carry the entire story. Indigenous veterans were thousands of people with thousands of different lives. His experience cannot represent all of them. What he can do is reveal something Canadians often avoid looking at. Because even when an Indigenous soldier became celebrated, even when he earned recognition for excellence, even when he wore the uniform as documented proof of service, the return home could still be complicated in ways most Canadians never had to consider. Prince captured that feeling in a sentence so simple it almost slips past you. As soon as I put on my uniform, I felt a better man. Think carefully about what that implies. It implies that before the uniform, he had been treated as less. That the uniform gave him a dignity he had been denied, not by the battlefield, but by his own country. And it implies something more haunting still. If the uniform made him feel like a better man, what happens when the uniform comes off? For many veterans, removing the uniform is already difficult. It is the end of a life where everything is defined, role, purpose, structure, even when that purpose is terrifying. Returning to civilian life means losing that clarity and trying to become ordinary again while carrying extraordinary memories. For many Indigenous veterans, that loss could feel doubled, because civilian life did not only mean ordinary, it could mean returning to old structures, old assumptions, old limitations, old attitudes, and realizing that the country which needed them in war might not treat them as fully equal in peace. The end of the war is often described as celebration, parades, kissing in the streets, church bells. But for soldiers, the end is often quieter: orders, waiting, demobilization, transport, a slow unraveling of the identity you have been wearing for years. You can see it in photographs of returning troops. Some smile, some do not. Some look older than they should. Many look like people who have been forced to become adults in the harshest way possible. For Indigenous veterans, the return carried an additional tension. What would Canada be like when they came home? Some believed their service would change things, that their sacrifices would be recognized not only in words, but in the way they were treated as citizens, that the uniform would become a key that unlocked a better future. And to be precise, some did find opportunity. Some received benefits. Some built new lives. Some became leaders, activists, community builders, veterans who carried their experience into public life with purpose. But the historical record also documents that many faced unequal treatment and unfair barriers when it came to veterans' benefits and post-war support. This is not rumor. It is a documented pattern discussed in public history, government writing, and academic research. What did that inequality feel like on the ground? It often did not announce itself as cruelty. It announced itself as confusion, a form sent back, a request for documentation that others did not need, an entitlement not explained, a benefit that seemed to flow easily for some and not for others. And sometimes it announced itself as something far more direct, something that cut to the core of home and identity: land. For many Canadians, land is property, something you buy, sell, and inherit. For many Indigenous communities, land is more than that. It is continuity. It is language. It is history written into place. It is family memory and spiritual geography. It is not interchangeable. So when post-war land programs and entitlements became part of the veteran story, The stakes were not merely economic, they were existential. Some Indigenous veterans returned expecting to access the same post-war opportunities promised to veterans, and found that the path was not equal. Some returned to find that government decisions tied to land had affected their communities in ways that felt like betrayal. Imagine what that does to a veteran's inner world. You fight in Europe, you watch friends die, you endure hunger and fear, you do what the country asked, and then you come home and you feel once again that the country is unsure whether you are fully included in the we it keeps talking about. That is not a small disappointment. That is a fracture. It affects how a man sees his service. It affects how he sees his country. It affects how he sees himself. And it creates a painful contradiction inside Canadian memory. Canada is genuinely proud of its role in the Second World War, and it should be. Canadians fought, died, and helped liberate people from tyranny. But the same era contains an uncomfortable truth. While Indigenous veterans fought for freedom overseas, they did not always receive equal freedom and equal treatment at home. That truth does not erase the pride, it deepens it, if Canadians are willing to face it. Many veterans also carried the war itself inside them in ways that were never fully addressed. War trauma did not become easier to bear because it was widely shared. Veterans across Canada carried invisible wounds. Many did not speak of them. Many were told not to. Some grew quiet. Some grew angry. Some grew distant. Indigenous veterans carried those same burdens and often did so in environments where support was limited and where their experiences could be misunderstood or minimized. When a country says, "Thank you for your service," it can mean it, but gratitude without equity becomes a hollow sound. Over time, the remembrance landscape in Canada began to shift. Indigenous military service began to be more explicitly acknowledged. Museums, public conversations, and dedicated commemorations created more space for these stories. That matters, because recognition can be a form of repair, even when it comes late. But recognition is also complicated. Remembrance can become a substitute for justice if it is not paired with material change. A country can build monuments and still leave bureaucratic damage untouched. A country can say we remember and still not fully confront what was done. So the honest accounting of this story must hold two truths simultaneously. Indigenous veterans served with courage and distinction, and many faced unequal treatment when they returned. If you hold only one of those truths, you do not have history. You have a slogan. Consider what the return looked like in the plainest terms. He steps onto Canadian ground again and feels the strange disorientation of home. It smells familiar. The sky feels wider. The streets have not been bombed. People walk with a kind of ordinary freedom that feels almost surreal after years of rationing and fear. He expects relief, and he does feel relief, at least at first. But then reality speaks in quieter ways. A question at an office, a delay, a policy, a conversation where someone's tone shifts when they hear where he is from. The moment when he realizes that the uniform did not permanently change what Canada is, it changed him, and he is expected to fit back into a system that has not fully made room for what he has become. A veteran is not a war story. A veteran is a person who has to keep living after the war story ends. The war overseas was meant to teach the world something about human dignity, about what happens when a state decides some lives matter less. Indigenous veterans fought against that kind of thinking abroad. and many came home to a version of it waiting in their own country. If you take nothing else from this story, take this. Indigenous veterans did not only help defeat tyranny, they also exposed a contradiction inside Canadian identity, a contradiction that still echoes today. They served, they sacrificed, they earned respect under fire. And in doing so, they asked Canada to live up to its own stated ideals. That is not only a wartime story, that is a Canadian story, and it is still unfinished. The next time you see a photograph of a young man in uniform standing stiffly beside a flag, do not only ask where he fought, ask what happened when he came home. Ask what promises were made. Ask which ones were kept. When Canada says we will remember them, those words need to mean something beyond a ceremony. They need to mean that the country understands what it asked of Indigenous veterans and what it owed them in return. Because if remembrance is real, it does not end in silence. It ends in responsibility. And that responsibility to tell the truth, to honor service with fairness, and to repair what can still be repaired is what makes a country worthy of the sacrifices made in its name.